for those who've not been engaged or participating previously, to get an idea of, here are the different financial incentives that you have, which are really two things: NPRA, net payment reconciliation, which is essentially the savings you have on the bundle, and then the ICS portion, which is essentially internal cost savings, the savings you could have, in a gain share arrangement with the hospital, reduce, physician preference items, implant costs, things of that nature. Go through that, and then go through a few other things on the target pricing, really explaining what is the target pricing for advanced BPCI advanced, and certainly some of the differences between classic and BPCI advanced. I think one of the overwhelming challenges that happened in BPCI classic for those who participated was the two main factors. One was the national trend factor decreasing quarter over quarter. And then you're receiving your, number two, receiving your target price and not really knowing that until the time of the reconciliation. And so CMS has really made from the feedback that came back from Classic, they've made a really strong attempt to correct and address those things in this target pricing. It's not going to be perfect, but certainly an improvement. With one, having several modifiers inside of it that allow for case mix adjustment, an increase of, if you suddenly have more patients who are, higher risk or higher cost, there's adjustments that occur around those patients and that mix. And then number two, and I think most importantly, is you receive prospective pricing. So, before you decide to move forward in a clinical episode, you'll know what your pricing is before you enter into that risk period. So, well, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sean and let him dive down into all the details for you guys. All right. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jim. We're excited to be able to cover this topic for you today on financial incentives and to get into some of the details that go into the pricing methodology and the adjustments as well. So you're all very familiar, I'm sure, with Jim. He and Jerry and Sue helped to build the largest bundled payment convening group for orthopedics. Fusion5 has the OrthoForm, OrthoConnect preferred status. And with that, Jim has built a very strong team of individuals. And I'm certainly grateful to be part of that team. My background is with Remedy Partners, also a DC think tank on bundles. And I've also managed a clinic. I started a medical group and sold that, which became Utah's largest home visit medical group. So we contracted with Optum for their top 1% of utilizing lives. It was a total PCP, full capitation model. And then I've also been in post-acute care. I've been a licensed nursing home administrator for 20 years. So I'm excited to bring my contribution to the team. And it's a really stellar team at Fusion5. So as Jim mentioned, we're going to get into some of the details that I know are of interest to a lot of people wanting to better understand the mechanics of what is it that goes into the target price. How are the payment streams going to flow? How are those funds going to be shared? And then we'll also briefly at the end talk into a MACRA and some of the upsides there of being in the advanced alternative payment model. So let's get into target pricing. So the anchor of the episode is determined by the inpatient admission. So in the case of a surgery, it includes the time of surgery and then 90 days post-acute. So all services that go into that episode are combined and create a sum of cost, if you will. So you naturally have your physician's professional fee, the hospital's technical charge, the nursing home, IRF, LTAC, home health, etc. All of those costs for 90 days go into the episode. Anything in excess of that is of costs in excess of your target calculation is downside risk to you. That's money that we would have to pay back together to Medicare. And of course, if you underspend the target calculation, that's money that can be shared, and that's for your gain. So just some basics there on target pricing, that it is a retrospective program. It's interesting to me when, when bundles first came out, and even until today, when you talk about bundled payments, perhaps you've seen this in people that you talk to. Sometimes the immediate thought that people get is that this is a prospective program, that somehow a hospital gets a bundle of money and then they become the payer. Well, in fact, as we know, this is a retrospective program, and there's a retrospective reconciliation for all of the costs, and then there's the funds that flow from that. So as we get into target price a little bit, we want to start high level with this illustration that you're going to have the baseline costs, i.e. history, the 2013 to 16. There, in this advanced methodology, will be some modifiers. And we think these are very good things for physician group practices. These will address some of the problems that we've had in classics, such as the national trend. So we'll talk about these modifiers. I think you'll find those very interesting. And then, of course, we have to factor in the CMS discount. I would call this the de facto margin for Medicare and what they're receiving upside financially from the program. The sum then of those becomes the target price. So the claims, speaking of the baseline cost, that first bubble, is a 4-year initial period to get the target price that we will see in May, which Medicare will give us. So this will be 13, 14, 15, and 16. And then going forward, there is going to be a 3-year retrospective look back after the initial performance year is completed. So the first will be 4, ongoing will be 3. So we should have this baseline period information, your target calculation, sometime in May. Knowing Medicare, and I'm sure you've seen this and we've seen this in our collective experience, we're anticipating the end of May. Whether it comes before or not, we're certainly prepared. We're anticipating terabytes of information. A lot of this information is going to come in raw form. So we'll be aggregating and applying our science to it to really arrive at what are the safe bundles here for you and for us. So let's get a little bit into these modifiers. I like to think of modifiers in terms of what is going to be set against the target price in order to create that calculation. In other words, I think of modifiers somewhat prospectively, whereas when you get to the performance period reconciliations, the after the fact, if you will, performance, those tend to be more adjustments that are made. So let's start at this front end, and let's talk about these modifiers a little bit one by one, and why these are of benefit to you, and how these are going to affect your target calculation. So in general, these are made to your baseline. They create your target price. Some of these are information that only CMS has. So we will learn more about the methodology of these when the data is released in May. Some of these, as you can see, will apply to the hospital, and some of these will apply to your physician group. So left to right, on the patient case mix adjustment, this is basically CMS's way of looking between the different DRGs within an episode and looking at the medical severity. So these are the medical severity DRGs. Say, for example, they're looking at 469 and 470. If they see a significant difference between the two DRGs in your episode compared to your historical, then they would make an adjustment for that. For example, at a hospital level, let's say that particular hospital was doing more trauma historically and less now, or it could be the inverse. CMS is going to adjust for that because the the target calculation, as you will recall in advanced, is based on the hospital. Now, there are some other factors here, these other three, but this basically gives a good method for CMS to say, okay, if the hospital has a different case mix, then CMS is going to apply that patient case mix adjustment. Moving to the second box, then, the peer-adjusted trend factor, I like to think of this as a little bit of a regionalization, if you will. Even though Medicare is basing your target calculation on the hospital, they're also basing it on your peers of like taxonomy to you within your region. So this is where your metropolitan statistical area comes in, similar practices. And this can benefit you if you are already a low-cost group. That means that your adjustment for this particular category here, that most likely you would have a higher target calculation. And you would already be performing well against that. Inversely, if you are a higher cost historical performer, this means then that there is some opportunity in relation to your peers to bring those costs down. So similarly, when you look at the PGP offset, I also like to think of this one as it's much like a peer-adjusted factor in that they are looking at your standardization of data compared to peers in your region. This one, however, the PGP offset, it gets a little more into the hierarchical condition coding. So they're looking at the the comorbidities of your patients in relation to peers. Is there a group that is taking higher functional patients or lower functioning patients in comparison to yours? This is a nice way that Medicare can normalize and smooth that data so that it's really more of an apples comparison to each other. And lastly, this relative case mix. I like to think of this as accounting for your case mix. So if on the left-hand side with patient case mix adjustment, we talked about the hospital base, you see the ACH there in that sub box. If the hospital was doing more trauma then or now, think of this relative case mix on the very right, similar to that. It's just that the relative case mix is specific to you in the PGP. So a number of different smoothing factors here. The thing that's most interesting to me when I sum this up is, one, it provides a normalization and standardization to where equitably you can be compared to peers and others of your peers who are performing at that hospital with some degree of predictability. So we think these are very good things. Again, these are some of these methodologies are yet to be fully revealed by Medicare. But in principle, it seems like Medicare has made some good progress this way for really getting to a regional and a peer level versus just a national trend factor, which is what we saw in Classic.
Yeah, I think this is Jim. I just want to add one little comment on that. I think when, for those that were in BPCI Advanced or BPCI Classic, you were used to seeing, DRG 469, DRG 470 as separate target prices. And then eventually you even saw that the fracture care, the HEMIs, and the primary, the elective cases got split out into additional costs. You're not going to see that this time. They're blending all of that together, right? So even 470 and DRG 469 are going to be blended into one clinical episode target. And so the problem with that is that in the current Classic methodology, you don't have a way to account for changes where suddenly you bring 2 or 4 new traumatologists onto your practice and your case mix completely changed. You have all these really high cost, $38,000, $40,000 cases suddenly hitting your bundle, and you haven't made an adjustment for that. You change physicians. There's you're suddenly covering a new hospital in which it has, sicker patients that are more challenging to deal with. All of these modifiers are CMS's attempt to allow your practice to evolve and change and to make adjustments in order to account for those changes and not penalize you for how you were in the past. So again, we have to see how it plays out, but we think it's going to be a good thing. I do want to emphasize that those that have been in BPCI before, you're going to have one target price per clinical episode. So you're not getting a DRG 469 and 470 separated target pricing. You're going to have one price that's a blend of both of those. Back to you, Sean.
And that's a great place to pick up on this second box, Jim. The fact that in classic versus advanced, as Jim was saying, the target price standard, that middle column, is different. Those that are in classic know that the target price is based on each DRG. So right now, you have a target price for 469 and 470. In the new methodology, there is a weight-adjusted average for a clinical episode, and you have multiple DRGs in a clinical episode. So you now have lower extremity joint replacement is one clinical episode, in which is 469 and 470. Now, the pause many of you may be having at this point is, oh gosh, I had more trauma cases then, or I have more trauma cases now. If those two are combined, how am I going to have an equitable fairness here? And that goes back to those modifiers that we were talking about on the previous slide, that there is that adjustment that's made by Medicare. They will look at your case mix for your clinical practice then versus now. They'll also be looking at that case mix within the hospital. And so that all gets adjusted. Even though it's clinically combined into one episode, it's all adjusted, it's all weighted. We think this is actually a good thing, this middle column, because it makes it easier, in essence, for the program to be administered if everything is in one clinical episode. Now, going to the standardized baseline, this is a big difference on the left from experience of past to what will be October 1st. If you were a practice that had a low standardized baseline, you were already a top performer, spending not a lot of money on a clinical episode. That was a bad thing for you because you were judged against yourself. What wiggle room did you have? So the past design had some limited life to it. With this new baseline in advanced, Medicare is adjusting for that and saying, okay, we're now going to base your past claims, your standardized baseline, at a hospital level. So this can be a standardization factor for you if you have multiple surgeons doing surgeries at that hospital. You'll now be able to have more of a peer factor rather than a just against yourself factor. And then, of course, there are the other adjustments that I mentioned in the previous slide. So we see this as a very positive thing for you. If you're a higher or a medium performer in cost, this gives you more room to improve. I should say, if you already have a lower cost, the good news for you is you're now going to be compared against others at that hospital and others in your peer area. So two good things there. Moving to the last column, there's a factor here when it actually comes time for the adjustment, where prior you had the national trend factor. And I'm probably hearing a collective sigh right now if the microphones were turned off. Maybe some colorful words used as well when we say the words national trend factor, because it was very unfair to you. And Jim touched on this. What if you are already a low-cost provider? If you were, say, at 18K and Medicare applied a 16% national trend factor, 18% of 16K is a bigger proportionate number than if you were having that 16% applied to you if your average costs were 26K. So the factor now is it's more based on your regional factors as contained within your hospital. So for example, a couple of subsets of this, they're going to look at the payment model changes, the fee-for-service changes. DRGs usually only go up, as we know, in cost. So if over time in your your initial 4-year look back and then your 3-year ongoing, the costs have gone up with your DRGs, that's going to be factored for, as is the case mix that we've talked about. So these are all things that can come out in your performance period.
This is an important factor also because there's a few organizations that experience a change in the their hospital that they go to has experienced a change in their DRG payment, right? So their DRG payment was an IPPS and it changed to some community or it had just a different designation. And that means that that DRG has potentially changed in cost by $2,000 or $3,000. This factoring and adjustments should account for any of those changes.
Yeah. So one of the questions we often get here is there an incentive to move your cases to a lower cost hospital? And when you look at these different modifiers that we covered on the previous slide, you begin to see very quickly that no, there is not. The fact is CMS is going to weight your performance period adjustment based on the case mix of the hospital where you did your surgeries. And they will be looking at your relative case mix, your peer adjusted trend factors, the different physician group practices in your area. So there really is the motivation, the incentive here to just do well where you're at. If anything, if you think about a high cost hospital, that's more opportunity than a lower cost hospital. If a higher cost hospital maybe has some higher costs with implants and medical supplies, perhaps they're overutilizing their post-acute care. Those then are great opportunities for us as partners to be able to adjust the lever on that. Can we get into a lower cost on the medical supplies? And we'll talk here in the next slide about internal cost sharing, create those alignments. Can we have lower post-acute care alignment? So the higher cost hospitals actually have some good opportunity. And the message here is that there is a lot of methodology that's going into the adjustments to make things as fair as possible. So that's a good segue to look at how the funds actually flow. What are your payment streams? Well, there are 3 revenue opportunities for you, both from reconciliation, in other words, your costs in relation to your target calculation, from internal cost savings with your hospital, and from macro. So let's dive a little bit into all 3. With your net patient reconciliation amount, your NPRA, again, these are your variances to your target calculations. These are going to be driven largely by your post-acute utilization. For example, if you were sending patients to an IRF, that could be a 15 to 18K add to your episode cost. Whereas if you could send your patient home, that's typically going to be about a 3K episode. So you can right there just see significant savings from next side of care decisions, things that can drive your NPRA. Let's talk a little more about the ICS, the cost savings that you can generate working with your hospital, and we facilitate this so that you can share in costs with them and really create that alignment. But before we do that with the ICS, let's just briefly mention here these quality measures. There are 7 that have initially been published by Medicare, 2 of which apply to all clinical episodes. Now, it's interesting to look at all-cause hospital readmissions. Does that really apply to a surgical physician group practice? Probably not, but these are Medicare's efforts to have a claims-based system and to ease into this at first. There is no reporting requirement until 220. Now, likely we expect there will be more reporting requirements, but that's a nice reprieve, if you will, that we'll get, that Medicare will just be looking at claims for that period of time. Now, these other quality the metrics are just applicable to some of the episodes. And you can think of these quality metrics in kind of a sequence that you, they're going to look in aggregate at your different scores of your different metrics, that previous slide, and then they would apply a composite quality score. And that then creates the factor that could go down for you in your reconciliation. I think the safe thing to say here, and Jim was saying this to me earlier, we can account for it on the front end as a sunk cost, if you will. If we don't plan on getting the 10% of total reconciliation for quality performance, that's somewhat the expectation. But being able to get these, should be a reasonably, well, we'll see, but it should be a reasonably attainable thing, given that these are just measured from claims. For example, this all-cause readmission measure. The hard part is how much control can you have on the hospital readmission. So it's a start, and likely we'll see with quality reporting that there are going to be some individual reporting factors and things that will likely be more within your control. These are a series of next 4 slides that I find very illustrating and fun. I'm a visual learner, and so these really help, I think, the understanding of how are the funds going to flow. So we talked about 3 things: the NIPRA, the internal cost savings, and macro. Let's leave macro for the last, and let's just talk about the 2. Let's say, as you look at this $2,000 here, next to the CMS logo, that you were able to generate $2,000 positive variance to your calculation. Say, for example, you had a target price of $22K, your actual episode cost was $20, you've got that bundled savings of $2K. Our convener costs, let's put coming off of that, so your $2,000 turns into $1,750. So that $1,750 goes into your savings pool, that the piggy bank icon there. Now let's just say that that is the only savings you have, that positive variance to spending calculation. Let's say in this bottom half here that you have no internal cost savings. That money, that $1,750, as you follow the piggy bank right, then can flow to you as the episode initiator, and then flows to your surgeon. So the surgeon is capped at 50% of the fee for service. We can think of this in loose terms as the professional fee. So let's say the physician's pro fee was $1,400, $700 of that $1,750 can flow to the gain share, i.e. the physician. The really beneficial thing here, and we talked about this somewhat last week, is what happens with the rest of that money. The safest thing to say there is that it can go toward the overhead of the practice. So $1,750 minus $700, you've got then $1,050 of the $2,000 you generated that can flow to your general overhead. So very quickly, you can see how that per episode, per case, can start positively contributing to the costs for your executives, for your general overhead, and how all of the surgeons in the practice can really benefit from that. Say you have a hand surgeon, a sports medicine physician, their costs will decrease as these funds in excess of what the surgeon receives goes to the practice. So this is a scenario 1, positive NIPRA, no internal cost savings. But watch how these things then start to add up differently. Let's take scenario 2. You have 0 NIPRA. Let's say on that same target price of 22, the sum of everybody's spending was 22. But let's say because of your good negotiation and working with us and working with an episode initiator collaborative that we are helping to facilitate, that you generate $1,000 in savings. Say you bring down your implant costs, medical supply costs, your surgical kits, etc. All of this can be carefully accounted for and fall under the generous rules that Medicare has provided us for internal cost sharing. And let's say that you had $1,000 in savings. And some of you are thinking about your supply costs right now, some of your implant costs, and you're thinking that could be a pretty conservative number. So even if, let's say in this scenario too, you had no savings from an episode. Maybe the person went to a more expensive post-acute care, you broke even on that. But yet you've kind of got this built-in security blanket, if you will, of this ICS. And let's say you have a 70-30 split with the hospital. Your $700 then feeds your savings pool. And if we said the professional fee for the physician was $1,400, you could flow that money to the physician or to the surgeon. So the interesting thing with the rule is the physician is capped at 50% of his or her professional fees or fee for service, but that money can come from your savings pool. And your savings pool can be derived from either your savings on the episode or some of the fixed internal cost savings that you can build with your hospital. So more than one way to make your surgeon happy and to be able to gain share with your surgeon. Now let's quickly just get into an even better scenario. Let's talk about what if you had savings from NIPRA and savings from internal cost savings. In this case, we're saying, okay, let's go back to saying you saved $2,000. Now let's say that you had a $400 total savings on your internal cost sharing. Your agreements with the hospital can vary, but generally the first amount of 50% of the professional fee will flow to the physician. So let's just say that it was only $400. Well, that $400 can feed your savings pool together with the same NIPRA, and you then can split that savings pool. Let's say of the $1,750 that you have from NIPRA, you give the $300 to the physician, and then you give the full $400 to the physician. Well, now there again, you've got money that's going to your physician. The full $700 is coming, the 50% to him or her, and that excess money can feed your practice, can go to the overhead. So this is a partial representation, meaning on your internal cost savings, say there was only $400, that can flow to your physician. And lastly, we'll conclude here. What if you had a very nice scenario where you had a $2,000 savings on your NIPRA, but say you had a $1,000 savings on your internal cost savings, and that 70-30 split, if the full up to 50% amount is flowing to your physician, you can just simply out of your savings pool pay your physician that full amount from the internal cost savings from that hospital portion. And then the full amount of your NIPRA is feeding to your practice. So I hope those graphics have kind of illustrated that this is really powerful, that you can have two types of savings. And I like to think of the internal cost savings as more fixed. NIPRA certainly gets to the point of more predictable when we help you with your post-acute network, when we're helping you with case management and screening patients and having preoperative conversations, functional assessments. All of that the NIPRA becomes more predictable as time goes on. But the ICS can be very fixed, and it can really be nice for the practice. Jim, do you want to say anything on this?
No, I think that's good.
Okay, great. Well, let's get into that third revenue stream then of incremental value for you. We've talked to NIPRA. We've talked the internal cost sharing from the hospital. I think a lot of the reason physicians or physician group practices are getting into BPCI Advanced is for the added value that it is considered an advanced alternative payment model. So let's talk about MACRA a little bit. 2016 legislation, bipartisan support. There's no question, I think, in the country that the legislature agrees that we've got to get to value. It's better to have participants that share in a value stream, and we need to reward physicians for getting us there. So MACRA does a number of things, but it replaces the, you'll recall the sustainable growth rate formula, SGR. I think it was every October we would be sitting on pins and needles and we'd hear the news stories, or maybe you'd see them come across your listservs of, is Congress going to approve the next year's raise for physicians? And every October somehow they'd seem to do it, or maybe there would be a delay in the formula. Well, that was old hat material way of doing things. So MACRA essentially replaces that SGR. And in so doing, it embraces this philosophy of we want to get providers to a place where they share in the savings, where there's incentive and alignment for volume, not for volume, but for value. So you have two different paths within MACRA. You have a choice, and most of you, I'm sure, are already in the MIPS path, the Medicare Improvement Payment System. That requires you, as I'm sure many people here on this call are onerously nodding to right now, to report your data to Medicare. The frustrating part for physicians is it's extra clicks a lot of times in your EMR. I remember the practice that I was managing. A lot of colorful words were shared about why do I have to click these 5 extra boxes? Well, we need it to be reportable, so we can't just have open notes. So it's an onerous requirement, right? It's kind of meaningful use in PQRS version 2.0. And you're all living that dream. I'm being sarcastic right now of MIPS. Wouldn't it be nice to be engaged in an advanced alternative payment model where instead of having the reporting requirements of MIPS, you simply have the engagement of being involved with an APM? Well, BPCI Advanced is considered an advanced alternative payment model. And the great advantage to you is that you not only have, the great advantage is you not only have the decreased reporting requirement of MIPS, but you get the automatic 5% upside to your professional fees. Now, there are some conditions. You do have to be using a certified EHR, 50% of your physicians within your practice, which most here probably are. There are some quality reporting requirements with BPCI Advanced. As we said, right now it's claims-based. Come 220, there will likely be more quality reporting requirements. And then you do, as an advanced alternative payment model, by definition, have to have some type of financial risk. And BPCI Advanced does have that. If the sum of claims is greater than the target calculation, that's the financial risk. So there are those conditions which are very attainable and I think a much better path than MIPS. And another condition is that you have to, within MACRA, if you're going to be an advanced alternative payment model, have a certain threshold of either payment or count. Now, the thing to remember here is this only applies to your Medicare beneficiaries, and I should say your Medicare traditional beneficiaries. This does not apply to your Advantage, your Medicare replacement patients. It does not, your N is, you're not looking at your commercial patients the same. These are just your Medicare patients. So the question you should ask yourself right now, looking at this right column of 2019, 20%, of all of your Medicare patients, traditional, right now, would you say that 20% of the cases that you would sign up for under BPCI would attribute under bundled payments? So if you look, for example, at the sum of your lower extremity joint replacements, which is going to be your biggest N, and divide that into your total Medicare dollars, or excuse me, patient count, are you going to meet that threshold? So there is that threshold requirement, and it does grow. Medicare wants to really grow that, and we highlight 2021 because that's when the rule changes that they want to then have commercial plans as an option for you to count as well. The goal here is to shift to value and to Medicare with its monopoly power to really get others engaged. And I think it's always kind of a mystery to a lot of us as why aren't commercial plans more engaged in bundles? This is a way that Medicare is encouraging this. So that's a little bit about macro. You do have to have EHR, have some downsizing risk, have some quality reporting aspects. You do have to meet the patient count threshold. But the advantage to you is you get, I think it's, well, you'll determine best, but I would suggest that this is a better path than MIPS. One, because it's less time, and two, because you get the 5% upside to your professional fee. Our last slide here looks at the different advanced alternative payment models. When I worked in the think tank, I was able to help write white papers on comprehensive primary care plus, oncology care model, just some amazing amount of resources that Medicare, i.e. funding, has put into those. Just in OCM, for example, they provide $160 per member per month for care management, or earlier goals of care conversations, advanced care planning. We know that ACOs, looking at that top right box, are a big factor of advanced alternative payment models if they are two-sided risk. In other words, if you have downside risk, if you're not just shared savings, as an ACO, you can qualify as a advanced alternative payment model. So these mean these are your track 3 and your next gen ACOs. And then CJR is also an advanced alternative payment model. Now, we can talk in more webinars, more detail about CJR, ACO. Those do take precedence over BPCI advanced. There are a lot of things that we can still do. We do encourage you still to sign up if you are in a CJR market. We encourage you to work closely with your ACO. A lot of things that we can do, a lot of innovative, creative things that we can share within the Ortho Forum and Connect. And I think that's really the main thing to stress and to end on. One of the things that I really appreciate, collectively as Ortho Forum, Ortho Connect, there is this opportunity for us to share information. Many of you we've had a chance to visit, and we show you a slide that shows where you rank in comparison to all of the other forum members or Connect members. And that type of information is just hugely useful to your competitive orthopedists, and really provides an advocacy platform that Forum is really embracing to make sure that the rules are exactly as would be favorable to us as physician group practices. So a lot of good opportunity to be involved with these advanced alternative payment models, and to do it in a collective way, in a powerful way, through the Ortho Forum and the Ortho Connect. Well, Jim, do you want to lead us out here on next steps?
Yeah, I think that was good. I just wanted to tell everybody appreciate everybody joining us for the webinar. I know you were trying to cover a lot of different topics, in less than an hour, and for participants who are kind of at different varying stages of their engagement in bundle payments. So any additional follow-up questions that you may have, feel free to reach out to anybody on our team. When we get together and meet in person, we can kind of cover some of these topics a little bit more in depth. But thanks a lot for jumping on, and look forward to you guys on the next webinar. Any feedback that you can provide was always welcome. We're constantly trying to improve the series and information we're putting out there. So anything you want to provide on feedback would be wonderful. So thank you guys very much for attending.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.